Hey guys, it's Brian with Do It Yourself Real Estate Videos, and today I want to talk about slow motion, adding a little bit of slow motion to your B-roll or to your listing tours to give it sort of a cool cinematic effect. So to understand slow motion, we're going to have to talk a little bit today about math. The way that slow motion works, we have to begin with frame rate. And the frame rate is the frames per second, the number of pictures that are being taken every second. Typically, most cameras, most editing software is set up for 30 frames per second. That tends to be what the human eye can interpret pretty cleanly, still gives it a bit of an artistic touch. Most of the commercials you see on TV are shot at 30 frames per second. Your phone defaults to 30 frames per second. You'll often see 24 frames per second. This means there's only 24 photos per second. You see this more with movies. It adds a little bit more of a cinematic quality to it. And then typically the jump from 30 frames per second is up to 60 frames per second. And 60 frames per second, again, is twice as many pictures being taken through your camera every second. And that's the frame rate we want to shoot in when we shoot slow motion. Because what happens is you take 30 pictures in a second, and then when you spread that out, those pictures get further apart. When you slow-mo it down, maybe in half, so to 50% speed, it slows it down and there's gaps between each picture. And that's what gets that sort of stuttered look. Now, if you take 60 snapshots every second and you spread it in half, you still have 30 shots every second, even if you cut your time, or really double your time when you spread it out or slow it down by 50%. You're still going to get 30 frames per second. So that gets that much smoother slow motion. The next step up from 60 frames per second typically is 120 frames per second. Now this is what your phone shoots at when you do the ultra slow-mo. So if you think about it, you've got 120 pictures every second. So you can not only slow it down by 50%, you can slow it down by 25%, down to 25%, and you're still going to get 30 pictures every second. That's what gives that really smooth ultra slow-mo look. Okay, so right now I'm in 30 frames per second, so I want to do a little demo before I sort of do this tour. I'm going to throw my keys up here. That's what it looks like in slow motion. It's kind of that stuttered effect. But now when I do it in 60 frames per second, let's see how that changes. All right, so here we are at 60 frames per second. Now the first thing you might notice is that I look a little more vivid. Again, it's taking 60 snapshots a second of me talking. But watch what happens now when I throw my keys in slow motion. Notice how much smoother that was. It's because when you spread it out, you've still got those 30 frames per second. So again, you kind of have to understand the math. It's 30 frames per second when edited or viewed at 30 frames per second. Like if you're just watching on your phone in real time, you'll get that one shot, 30 shots every second. Shot at 60 frames per second and then spread out to 50% or slowed down to 50%, you now have those 60 frames spread out to 2 seconds. So if you chop down to 1 second, you still have the 30 frames, if you're tracking with me on the math. And then at 120 frames per second, it can spread out to 4 seconds and still get the 30 frames per second. So when you cut that 4 seconds down to 1 second, you still have the 30 frames per second, which gives you the really smooth look. Actually, let's look at that real quick. So what I want to do today is do a couple shots that show the difference between the 30 frames and 60 frames per second to show you how to get that nice, clean, cinematic slow-mo shot. Here we go. All right, DIYers, so that's how you do it. So remember, just set that for 60 frames per second if you want to shoot in slow-mo. You can find that on the camera settings on your DSLR camera, but let's say you're shooting with your phone, how do you find it? Well, take a look here. You can just see that it's in your camera settings. You can see that I've got mine set to 30 frames per second as standard. My slow-mo is actually set at 240 frames per second, which would allow me to slow it down 8 times. But that's how you make the change. So happy filming. Thanks for watching the video, and be sure to subscribe and like what you see. Talk to you soon. Bye.